My name is Jeff Jewell. I'm a civil engineer who has some unique knowledge about a rather obscure realm in the field of engineering, tide gates and flap gates. I have three very unique designs for what is known as a self-regulating tide gate, or SRT. Two of my designs are absolutely revolutionary, and they can be used even where there are no tides. I refer to these designs as variable backflow flap gates, or VBFGs. I have working copies of a side-hinged as well as a top-hinged VBFG. Fish love my tide gates. I think that, in time, farmers will love my tide gates as well. There are probably tens of thousands of tide gates around the world, and they have profound implications for fish and wetlands. I thought this was a very important topic, so I started a company, Jewel Tide Gates. It's all that I do. I think that I have the greenest job in the world, and here's why. How could anyone have a greener job than this? Most people have no idea what a flapgate is. This is a photo of a typical old-fashioned top-hinged flapgate. Flapgates are essentially one-way valves. They let water out, but do not let water in. They're used with dikes and levees, and they have been around for thousands of years. They're everywhere. For comparison, this is a photo of my VBFG. My flapgate design is wide open when there is no flow through the culvert, and it closes at some point during the rising tide after allowing some amount of backflow. This is a photo of the creek located upstream from one of my VBFGs in Skagit County. The creek reliably fills to this level on every flood tide. The VBFG closes like clockwork during the flood tide when the water reaches this level. It can be easily adjusted to fill the creek to any specified level or not to allow any backflow at all. Several hours later, during a following ebb tide, when the water levels are equal upstream and downstream, my flapgate pops wide open. This is video of the side-hinged VBFG at Edison Slough opening during a falling tide. As long as the water level downstream is higher than the water level upstream, there is a pressure or seating head holding the gate shut. When the water levels are equal, the seating head is zero and the VBFG pops open. It's elegantly simple. The Edison Slough SRT has been in operation with no malfunctions for 2 years as of January 15, 2011. If the tide is low enough, the creek upstream from the flapgate will drain completely and then fill to some level on the flood tide. I call this limited tidal flushing. It looks something like this. In this simplified animation, the tide, which is shown on the left, is rising and falling, or to be more proper, flooding and ebbing. During the flood tide, the ditch will rise to some preset level, at which point my VBFG will close. The olive-colored OG curves are a simplification of the groundwater level in the levee and beneath the field to the right of the ditch. During the ebb tide, the ditch drains completely if the low tide is lower than the ditch invert elevation. Because my VBFG opens wide and allows tidal flushing, endangered juvenile chinook salmon and other aquatic species have access to critical and now improved estuarine habitat located upstream from the tide gate. Replacing a traditional flapgate with my VBFG restores historic wetlands located upstream from tide gates by reintroducing limited tidal flushing to the drainage system. My design can be set to allow as little or as much tidal backflow as desired. Tidal flushing and protection from floods. You can have both. Restoring wetlands obviously benefits fish, amphibians, and waterfowl that require these habitats. It also discourages many nuisance, non-native invasive plant species. Obviously my flapgates are good for fish and wetlands. Fish love my tide gates. If operated sensibly, I believe that my VBFGs can improve agricultural production on land that is protected from high tides and high river stages by levees. This is a photo of the spectacular bulb fields located up in Skagit County in Washington State. It's my desire to see farming flourish while concurrently improving conditions for salmon. This is a simple graphic that shows a tidally influenced shoreline to the left, a levee, a drainage ditch, and to the right, farmed land which is protected by the levee and drained by the ditch. The animation illustrates the movement of groundwater through the soil. The pale blue curvilinear squares are a crude flow net. A flow net is defined by flow lines and equipotential lines, and it graphically shows what the flow field looks like. The groundwater actually moves very slowly, but over time the groundwater does move, and the movement has profound implications for soil moisture levels, saltwater intrusion, groundwater levels, and land subsidence rates. The elevation of the water at the various locations in this figure defines the amount of driving head in the flow system. The driving head provides energy, which pushes the water through the soil. In addition to the driving head, the seepage rates are affected by the transmissivity of the soil. The seepage varies over time with the ebbing and flooding tide, the rising and falling of the water level in the ditch, and the very gradual rising or falling of the phreatic surface or the groundwater level under the field. This is a bit complicated, and this graphic is a gross simplification, but this is important to understand. Proper drainage is critical for seed germination and optimal plant growth in farmland that is near sea level. Because my VBFG opens wide and does not require a trash rack, it will pass more water than a regular flapgate during a given ebb tide. This causes the water level in the ditches to be lower, and the soil drainage is therefore improved. My VBFG improves agricultural production in other ways besides better drainage. I'll get to that in a moment. Farmers should love my tide gates. I occasionally tell people that my VBFG is lunar powered. The rising and falling of the tide makes it open and close. Not only does it not consume power, the increased conveyance reduces the need for pumping. This saves energy. If the area being drained occasionally requires pumping to augment the gravity drainage through the tide gates, the frequency of the operation of the pumps will be reduced due to the increased conveyance capacity of the tide gates. This saves energy. Saving water is a bit more complicated. Maximizing drainage is only important when the soil is too wet. After the seeds have germinated and the soil moisture level is suitable for the crop being grown, maximizing drainage may be counterproductive. A traditional flapgate maximizes drainage at all times by maintaining a low water level in the ditch. This is undesirable during dry periods. A VBFG allows the amount of drainage, and therefore the soil moisture level, to be managed. A continually low water level in the ditch results in a gradient towards the ditch at all times. Over time, this will draw down the groundwater level in the adjoining field. In the absence of tidal flushing, the gradient driving flow towards the ditch is always present, unless the groundwater level is lower than the ditch inward elevation for some reason. With tidal flushing, the amount of time that a gradient exists and is driving groundwater towards the ditch is greatly reduced. This will reduce the flow of groundwater and will maintain the phreatic surface at a higher level. An elevated groundwater level allows sub-irrigation. With sub-irrigation, water from the capillary fringe is available to the root zone. A higher groundwater level also reduces the rate of aerobic decomposition of organic matter in the soil. The capillary fringe is a zone where capillary action draws groundwater into the soil column above the phreatic surface. Maintaining the groundwater at a higher level makes the capillary fringe available to the plants for more of the growing season. This saves water and energy since less irrigation and pumping of water is needed. By delaying the fall of the groundwater level, irrigation can be postponed and some volume of water will be saved. As the groundwater level falls, eventually the capillary fringe will be lower than the root zone and irrigation will be required. There are two ways to raise the water level in the ditch and thereby allow sub-irrigation. One, by allowing tidal flushing, and two, by installing a temporary check dam to prevent water from leaving the ditch during the low tides. If fresh water is withheld behind the check dam, it can be pumped and used for irrigation later on when the capillary fringe is below the root zone. Properly managed tidal flushing with a VBFG will not cause saltwater intrusion since the elevation that the ditch is allowed to fill to will be slightly lower than the groundwater level. If for some reason the water level in the ditch is slightly higher than the groundwater level in the field, the gradient will be small and the flow rate low. A regular pulse of groundwater flow towards the ditch will occur during each low tide. This will purge any salt water from the soil near the ditch. This photo shows the creek partially filled with water that has passed through the VBFG during the flood tide. The flapgate is closed at this time. The cultivated ground in the distance is about 3 feet higher than the water level in the creek. The water in the creek slows the rate that water drains from the soil and thus slows the rate that the phreatic surface falls. A few hours after this photo was taken, the water level in the creek was much lower due to the low tide. If any brackish water had seeped into the soil when the ditch was filled, groundwater now flowing towards the ditch likely purged the brackish water from the soil. Monitoring for elevated salinity levels in the soil adjacent to the drainage ditch and reducing the amount of tidal flushing may be necessary as the phreatic surface drops. By reducing the amount of irrigation required, we save both water and energy. Land subsidence can be caused by a number of processes. I'm focusing on subsidence caused by the decomposition of organic matter in the soil. My VBFG reduces land subsidence by raising the groundwater level, thereby decreasing the amount of organic matter lost to decomposition. Anaerobic decomposition means with air. Anaerobic decomposition means without air. In the presence of air, decomposition rates are much higher in comparison to when the organic matter is below the water table and air is not available. By allowing tidal flushing, my VBFG raises the groundwater level and preserves the organic matter in the soil by keeping more of the soil column saturated beneath the elevated water table. This graphic explains how a falling groundwater level results in increased aerobic decomposition and land subsidence. Note that the decomposition of organic matter produces CO2, hence my VFG also reduces greenhouse gas emissions. This is what the chemical reaction looks like. Organic matter, hydrocarbons, react with oxygen to form water and CO2. Farmers should be interested in this since the decomposition of organic matter in the soil affects the soil microstructure. It reduces the nutrient supply, it reduces the water holding capacity of the soil, it degrades the soil structure and reduces the infiltration rate of water in the soil. It makes the soil more erodible. The groundwater levels in farmland protected by levees should be managed, as opposed to simply maximizing drainage by lowering groundwater as much as possible year-round. This will preserve organic matter, reduce CO2 emissions, and improve soil fertility. There's a lot more to this subject. I will be making a video with much more in-depth information about this in the near future. Go to YouTube and subscribe to Juletide's channel to receive information about new videos. By filling and draining the ditches at least once, and sometimes twice a day, with the tides, my VBFG and tidal flushing clearly illustrate that, to some extent, it's true, dilution is the solution to pollution. Without tidal flushing, natural as well as man-made toxins and contaminants accumulate in the drainage system with growing concentrations. Eventually, they will be washed downstream after a runoff-producing event at a much higher and potentially harmful concentration. However, with daily tidal flushing, small quantities of contaminants or undesirable materials that are accidentally or incidentally introduced into the drainage system will be significantly diluted and flushed from the system. Elevated water temperatures are also reduced by the tidal flushing. That is, if the water downstream from the tide gate is cooler than the water level in the drainage system, and it nearly always will be. Dissolved oxygen levels are increased by the movement of water in the system as well as by the infusion of oxygen-rich water from downstream. If a major spill of some kind occurs, tidal flushing can be suspended while the spill is contained and dealt with. With the VBFG and daily tidal flushing, stagnant water is not available within the drainage system due to the regular filling and draining with the tides. In addition, natural biological control of mosquitoes will increase due to the improved water quality. Natural biological control means predation by the small fish and other organisms that feed on mosquito larvae. With tidal flushing and improved water quality, mosquito predation will rise dramatically. Any mosquito eggs or larvae in the drainage system that are not eaten will be flushed out to sea. In many places around the world, mosquito-borne diseases are a big problem for humans as well as for animals. These are the most relevant mosquito-borne diseases. Levees can be found on every continent on the planet except for Antarctica. It is estimated that there are 100,000 miles of levees in the U.S. alone. It is likely that there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of miles of levees in the regions of the world where malaria is endemic. Since a levee without a flap-gated culvert is a reservoir, it is plausible that there are many thousands of old-fashioned flap-gates creating stagnant water and breeding mosquitoes in the drainage systems in locales where malaria is a problem. Replacing flap-gates in malaria-prone areas with VBFGs would undoubtedly reduce mosquito populations, reduce malaria infections, and save lives. A 1% reduction in malaria cases equals 2.5 million infections and 10,000 saved lives every year. I cannot imagine a greener business than this. It's not just green, it's great engineering too. With a variable backflow flapgate by Joule tide gates, the amount of tidal flushing can be zero, no backflow at all, or any amount that is desired. It operates unattended, is easy to set, and it is fail-safe. Once set, the VBFG will close consistently when the water level reaches the desired elevation. It is nearly maintenance-free, is very heavy-duty, and has a long design life, on the order of 100 years. When used as part of a well-engineered drainage system, the variable backflow flapgate is flawless engineering. It even allows fish passage and water exchange at flapgates where there are no tides. I do more than simply design and fabricate tide gates and flapgates. My tide gates and flapgates are part of a unique drainage system. Good engineering should include a number of properly engineered features, in addition to an ingenious flapgate. And here are the design criteria that I used for my gravity drain and pump structure designs. I am available to assist you with conceptual designs or detailed designs for unbeatable and environmentally friendly tide gates, flapgates, gravity drains, and drainage system improvements. See my website at www.jultide.com and subscribe to Jultide at www.youtube.com.